newspapers as blankets,
Yeah.
makeshift towns named after the president. That's the picture that comes to mind when we think about Herbert Hoover and the Great Depression.
Yeah. It was a really challenging time.
Hoover, the 31st president, Republican, sandwiched between Coolidge and FDR.
Right.
He signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation.
Uh-huh.
But today, we're going deeper than your usual history lesson.
Oh, okay.
Hoover's approach to the Depression. How effective were his policies, really?
Interesting.
And we'll even touch on some things the economists still debate today. You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. Let's go.
Okay, so Hoover. Complicated guy, deeply committed to his beliefs. But a lot of people say he didn't handle the crisis well. Let's start with his core philosophy, limited government in the economy.
Right. Limited government intervention was a key part of his thinking.
So individual initiative, balanced budgets, like he thought the economy could just heal itself if everyone worked hard enough.
That was certainly part of his belief system.
But how did that play out when millions were out of work and struggling?
Well, he preferred job creation programs over direct relief for the unemployed.
Okay, so help them get back on their feet, not just hand out money.
Exactly. He felt strongly that work restored dignity and prosperity.
And he was really against excessive government spending, worried it would stifle economic growth and make people too dependent.
He was. He saw it as a potential roadblock to recovery.
But some people think that approach just made things worse, that the government needed to step up and do more.
There were certainly critics who felt that way. They argued that a stronger safety net was essential.
So were they right? Or was Hoover just following the economic thinking of his time?
It's important to understand the context. Back then, the idea of the government getting heavily involved in the economy was pretty new.
So uncharted territory.
Many economists actually thought cutting spending and balancing the budget was the way to go.
So Hoover wasn't alone in that thinking.
Not at all. It was a pretty mainstream view at the time.
So he was trying to figure things out, guided by what people thought they knew. But he also had a lot of pressure to act.
Oh, yeah. A tremendous amount of pressure.
Okay, let's talk about one of the most controversial things he did, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930.
Ah, yes. A very controversial decision.
Designed to protect American industries.
Yeah.
Raised tariffs on a ton of imported goods.
It did. Over 20,000, in fact. It was a pretty sweeping measure.
The idea was to boost American production, protect American jobs.
Exactly. Keep things made in America. That was the goal.
But it seems like it backfired big time.
It did have some pretty significant unintended consequences.
Other countries slapped on their own tariffs. Global trade basically ground to a halt.
It definitely contributed to a worsening global economic situation.
So how much blame does Smoot-Hawley get for how bad the Depression got?
Well, that's something historians and economists still debate today.
Really?
Most agree it made the global downturn worse, but to what extent is hard to say for sure.
Makes you think twice about protectionism.
It does, especially during a crisis. It shows just how interconnected the global economy is.
Right. One country's actions ripple out and affect everyone else.
Exactly. That was a key takeaway from that era.
Okay, so we've got economic turmoil, but Hoover also had to deal with rising tensions internationally.
He did. It was a very volatile time in the world.
And he was a big proponent of disarmament, thought it would calm things down and free up money for domestic use.
That was a core part of his foreign policy vision. Reduce military spending, ease global tensions.
And he signed the London Naval Treaty in 1930. Limited the size of navies.
A landmark agreement. It signaled a commitment to arms control.
A noble goal, but did it work?
It's a complicated question. While it did achieve some reduction in naval armaments, the treaty didn't address the underlying political and economic tensions that were brewing.
So he was trying to create peace through disarmament, but the world was still heading towards war.
Yeah, it was like trying to hold back a tide. The forces pushing towards conflict were pretty powerful.
And then there's his attempt to stabilize Europe's economy. The Hoover moratorium on debt repayments. What was that all about?
That was a bold move. He agreed to a one-year pause on intergovernmental debts, mainly those war reparations Germany owed.
Okay, so giving Germany a break, hoping to prevent a collapse that would drag everyone down.
Exactly, trying to create a ripple effect of stability. But it didn't quite go as planned. It faced opposition, especially from France, which was really counting on those payments.
And in the end, it didn't stop the German economy from imploding.
Unfortunately not. The underlying issues were just too severe.
So he was dealing with a collapsing global economy, international tensions, and a nation struggling with the Depression.
It was a lot to handle, a true test of leadership.
And then on top of everything else, Japan invades Manchuria in 1931, a blatant violation of international treaties.
A clear sign of Japan's growing ambitions and a direct challenge to the international order.
And that led to the Hoover-Stimson Doctrine.
Yeah.
A pivotal moment, right?
Absolutely. Japan's actions were a turning point.
So what did the doctrine say?
The U.S. would not recognize any territory taken by force, a statement of principle against aggression.
Strong words, but was there any action behind them?
That's the key question. It was mainly a diplomatic move, not a military threat.
So more like moral condemnation than actual intervention?
Yeah. Remember, the U.S. was in the middle of the Depression. People didn't want another war, especially one so far away.
So Hoover was in a tough spot, standing up for international law, but hesitant to get involved in another conflict.
It's a classic foreign policy dilemma.
And in the end, the Hoover-Stimson Doctrine didn't stop Japan.
It didn't. Japan continued on its expansionist path.
It seems like a theme, a leader facing huge challenges, trying to balance different priorities, and often getting criticized for his choices.
It was definitely a time of tough choices and unintended consequences.
So how do we make sense of Hoover's presidency?
Well, that's what we're going to continue to explore as we go deeper, looking at the effects of his policies both at home and abroad.
It's clear there's a lot more to uncover. So let's keep diving into the presidency of Herbert Hoover.
So we were talking about Hoover trying to handle the Depression at home and a lot of stuff happening internationally. It's tough when so much is going on at once.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder, could he have done more to help people during the Depression? Were there other things he could have tried?
People still ask that. Some say because he was so set on limited government, he didn't see how bad things were, or that maybe different programs were needed.
Like direct aid, or trying things with money to get the economy moving again. Seems like he had options, but wouldn't budge on his core beliefs.
He got a lot of flack for not doing enough, for being disconnected from how hard it was for everyday Americans.
All those Hoovervilles and people using newspapers as blankets, powerful images, really showed how much people were hurting and that they blamed him.
Yeah, it shows how economic problems really hit people where it hurts, and how political decisions matter.
It does. So how do we judge a leader in such a tough spot? By what they knew then, or by what we know now about economics?
That's a tough one. Hoover was working with the economic ideas of his time.
Yeah.
Even if they seem wrong now, can we really blame him for following what everyone thought was right? It's a debate. Some think even if his intentions were good, sticking to those old ideas made things worse. Others say he was just a product of his time, doing his best in a brand new kind of crisis.
Hindsight is 20/20, right? But no matter what, the Depression changed America and how people saw the role of government.
Definitely. FDR's New Deal came after. It was a reaction to how hands-off things were during the Depression.
So it was like a shift. The government had to step in when things got this bad and help people.
Right. A safety net.
So in a way, even if Hoover didn't agree with it, his presidency made a more active government happen.
Kind of ironic, isn't it? His time was a turning point, a before and after for the American economy. It also shows how important it is to learn from mistakes, adapt, and be ready to change direction when needed.
That's true for leaders and really for everyone. It's about growing, seeing when something's not working, and being open to new ideas.
Exactly. Now, let's go back to the world stage. We talked about Hoover pushing disarmament and trying to stabilize Europe with that debt pause. But Japan's expansion in Asia was a growing problem too.
Right. That Hoover-Stimson Doctrine, saying the U.S. wouldn't recognize any territory Japan took by force. A bold statement, but we said earlier, it didn't really have any teeth.
It was mostly about diplomacy and saying it was wrong, not about military action.
So was it just for show? A way for the U.S. to disapprove without really getting involved? Or was there something more going on?
Well, you got to remember what was happening back home. The U.S. was still stuck in the Depression. People really didn't want another war, especially one so far away.
So Hoover was stuck. He wanted to uphold international law and condemn what Japan did, but he didn't want to commit to a fight that many saw as not America's problem.
Exactly. Another classic foreign policy dilemma. How to do the right thing, but also be practical. How to have influence without getting in too deep.
And in the end, that doctrine didn't stop Japan.
Nope. They kept expanding.
Words without action don't always work.
That's a lesson that's repeated through history.
This all ties back to how connected things are at home and abroad. Hoover's choices internationally were affected by the economy here, and what he did abroad affected things back in the U.S.
It's a balancing act for any president, even more so during a crisis. Hoover's time shows just how complex leadership is. You got to make tough calls with incomplete information and try to balance competing things.
Yeah. It seems like his legacy is full of contradictions. A man with strong beliefs leading through crazy times. A champion of individual effort who saw how self-reliance wasn't enough when the whole system was broken. A peace advocate who watched the world slide toward war.
And while most people remember him for the Depression, he did other things too, before and after being president. His work helping people during World War I, being Secretary of Commerce, his writing about government and society, all of that shows a more complex picture.
It reminds us that history isn't black and white. Even the famous people are more than what we first think.
And that's why this deep dive is so interesting. We're not just listing facts, we're digging into a specific time, looking at the choices made, the roads not taken, and how they still affect us.
We've covered a lot. Hoover's beliefs, his policies, both at home and abroad. But as we wrap up, I'm curious about the man himself. What drove him? What scared him? What did he hope for America? How did being president change how he saw the world and his place in it?
Those are great questions. I think they tell us about Hoover the person, but also about leadership and facing really tough times in general.
Yeah. I want to understand that side of him.
We're back with the deep dive, still exploring Herbert Hoover, a president most people link to the Great Depression, but there's a lot more to his story.
It's easy to just think about the economic and political turmoil, but what about the personal side of being president, especially during those tough times?
Right. What were his motivations? What worried him? What did he hope for the country? How did being president change how he saw things? We often talk about presidents like they're just names in a book, but they were real people dealing with huge things. Absolutely. And Hoover had a unique background, a self-made man, an engineer, successful in business and in humanitarian work before he got into politics. He really believed in people working hard, being self-reliant, and using American ingenuity to solve problems.
So he came in optimistic, believing in the American spirit. But then the Depression hit, a crisis like nothing before it. How did that change how he saw the world?
It was a real test of his beliefs, the devastation, the suffering, the feeling that there was no hope. It forced him to face the limits of his own philosophy.
Did he ever question his idea of keeping the government out of things? Or did he become even more convinced, even as things got worse?
People definitely criticized him, said he wasn't doing enough, that he was out of touch with how much people were struggling. But we have to remember, he had a certain way of thinking, one that emphasized self-reliance and being responsible with money.
So he was trying to apply those ideas to a situation that maybe needed something different. But even if his policies didn't always work, can we at least say his heart was in the right place? That he truly thought he was doing what was best?
I think that's fair. He was a man of strong convictions. He wanted to serve the nation. It wasn't about personal gain or political ambition. He honestly thought he was doing the right thing.
And that brings us back to the human side of things. He wasn't just a president making decisions. He was a person, feeling the weight of all that responsibility, seeing people suffer, trying to find answers to a problem that seemed impossible to solve.
And that human side often gets lost in history. We focus on the policies, the events, what happened in the end, but we forget those decisions were made by real people, people with hopes and fears just like us.
So how did Hoover deal with all that pressure? Being a leader during such a crazy time, did he ever have doubts, regrets?
He was known for keeping things to himself, being stoic. He didn't publicly question himself or his decisions, but I think it's safe to say it all took its toll, personally and politically.
It's hard to imagine going through all that and coming out the same. The responsibility, the criticism, the feeling that nothing you do is enough. It must have been incredibly tough.
And yet, even with the setbacks, he never lost faith in the American spirit. Even when things looked bad, he still believed things would get better, that the nation would overcome it all and be stronger.
That resilience, the determination to keep going even when it's dark. Maybe that's one of the biggest things he left behind. It reminds us that even when things feel hopeless, when we face huge obstacles, we keep fighting, keep working for a better future.
Exactly. And that's something we can all relate to today. With all the uncertainty, the division, the instability around the world, Hoover's experience shows us that being a leader isn't about having all the answers. It's about making the hard choices, learning from mistakes, and believing that progress is possible.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Herbert Hoover, I'm really struck by how complex his story is. The successes and failures, the things he strongly believed in, the compromises he had to make, his own personal struggles, and his public achievements. It shows us that history isn't always simple. Even the most famous people are more than what we see on the surface.
It's tempting to judge leaders from the past by what we know now, but I think it's better to try to understand them in their own time, to see the challenges they faced, and to realize that even when people have good intentions, things can still go wrong.
In the end, I think Hoover's story is about the human spirit, how resilient we are, our ability to learn and grow, and our hope for a better future.
A message that goes beyond any one president or historical period. It's about what it means to be human, facing hard times with courage, and never giving up hope for a brighter tomorrow.
We've been through a lot in this deep dive. The Great Depression, complicated international relations, the policies that shaped a nation, the struggles of a leader in uncharted waters. It's been fascinating. I hope you learned something and that it made you think.
It's been great exploring this part of American history with you. I hope it inspires you to keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep looking for new ways to understand the past, the present, and the future.
And that, my friends, is what the deep dive is all about. Until next time, keep exploring.